So I thought it would be a good idea for us today to really kind of, hi, Malia, for us really to kind of go ahead and start with Foundations, Unit 1. So I'm going to open up the chat and I'm going to make sure that everybody has that document. Hi, Hannah Kay. I want to make sure everybody has this document. This is the review document, which kind of, I think you should use to frame your studying, right? I've got a little graphic organizer for the SCOTUS cases in there. I've got a graphic organizer for the 9 foundational documents in there. Not to mention real, like just a massive amount of terms that I would know if I were you. Okay. Hi, Brandon. So that's my suggestion.
You gotta go.
What up? So why don't you go ahead and get out a sheet of paper, do whatever it is you want to maybe take some notes on. I think would be a good idea. I've, planned what I think would be smart for us to talk about. And we are going to get this done within 1 hour. That's my plan. And I will try and download this and make sure that I put it on the YouTube channel so that you guys can find it easily that way. Okay. Hi, Lindsay.
Hi.
All right. So why don't we just kind of start with, forgive me, but the beginning. And for this course, that's really the Declaration of Independence. Okay. And I'm guessing that today you would just like me to talk to you. Is that right? Yeah, I figured as much. Don't worry about it. It'll be fine. And thank you for turning your cameras on. If you don't want to turn your cameras on, I'm not going to make you. All right. So the Declaration of Independence, I think it's important for you to make sure you know what it is. A lot of AP students confuse it with the preamble of the Constitution. So maybe a wise grasshopper would make like a little T-chart so that we can compare the Declaration with the preamble of the Constitution. Because the beginning of the Declaration is also referred to as the preamble, just FYI. Okay. Let's make this full screen. Yeah. Okay. So one of the big things that the Declaration of Independence talks about are those unalienable rights. Oh, Brandon, it's so pretty where you are. Good for you. All of those unalienable rights. And you guys remember the enlightened thinker that proposed those? John Locke. John Locke influences the heck out of our government, guys. He influences Thomas Jefferson and the Committee of Five when writing the Declaration of Independence. And then we see his influence in the Articles of Confederation as well as the Constitution. And remember, Thomas Jefferson changes John Locke's unalienable rights, or John Locke refers to them as the natural rights of man. That might be a good distinction for you to make as well, natural rights of man. For John Locke, it's life, liberty, and property. And if you remember the Richard Hofstadter reading, our founding fathers are obsessed with property being kind of equal to liberty, right? So Jefferson switches this up to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And something else that I would note for the Declaration of Independence, this is our justification to separate. We're very clearly laying out our grievances. And if you ever want to cite one grievance in particular, I think your go-to should be no taxation without representation. You could also point out that Great Britain was the opposite of a limited government. And if you guys remember, limited government is one of those core concepts of American values that most Americans agree is good about our government and needs to be evident in our society. So remember, everything the king was doing was absolute and it was ridiculous. And so that's why the first government that we created, the Articles of Confederation, looked so fundamentally different. And it was like we were trying too hard to make it different, because we ended up making this system that just sucked. It was not good. it might have looked good on paper. And if Brutus I is around, I mean, they're gonna smite me for saying that, but it's true. Okay. So one more thing that I'd like you to know for the Declaration of Independence is it talks a lot about how good governments get their consent to govern from those who are governed, right? So they derive their power from the consent of the governed. That's worded much better. Derive their power from the consent of the governed. This is something that we also see in the letter from Birmingham jail. If you recall, MLK said it was ridiculous that these governments are supposed to represent African Americans, yet African Americans don't really get a say or are not really, viewed as citizens by those governments. So in the letter from Birmingham jail, there were a lot of connections to the Declaration of Independence. Remember, MLK talked quite a bit about natural rights of man as well. And last but not least, the Declaration is not a governing document. I want to make sure you understand that. Okay, not a governing document. It just kind of lays out our ideas. Hey, Rach, we're talking about the Declaration of Independence and how it's different from the preamble. Okay. All right, so it's not a governing document. Just want to be very clear. Okay, now let's compare that to the preamble to the Constitution. This is a governing document, right? And y'all, it shouldn't surprise you that the Constitution is the foundational document that makes the most appearances on this exam, which, I mean, duh, of course it does. There's 7 articles, there's 27 amendments. I mean, yeah, makes sense. And the preamble is just that first paragraph, right? Where it lays out the purpose of the new government. And if you ever watched that Schoolhouse Rock song, you know the preamble, right? We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility. And then they provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. We ordain and establish the Constitution of the United States of America. So that first paragraph just lays out the purpose of the new government, okay? It's a purpose statement. All right, so how do you feel about that? You feel okay? That makes sense? Good. Okay. And one more thing, sorry, for the declaration, so go to that side of that T chart that you just made. John Locke also talks about that social contract, right? That the governed enter into a contract with the government, giving it our consent. And if the government is bad and just, not doing what it's supposed to do, cut ties, right? That's where we can get rid of a new one. And then one more thing that they both do. So if you want to draw one of those little brackets, do you know what I'm talking about? Like one of these things, connecting the Declaration and the preamble. They both talk about the concept of popular sovereignty. And that's where the people have the real power. And if you want to write an actual line, the one from the Constitution is really easy. It's we the people, right? We the people. That sets up how the people are going to have the power in this new government. In the Declaration of Independence, it's a little bit longer. You don't have to write the whole thing. But it's that quote that says, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. I know that's a lot. You don't have to write the whole thing. Governments are instituted among men, deriving their power from the consent of the governed. Okay. Now I feel like we can leave the Declaration of Independence. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about the Articles of Confederation, because why not? And let's talk about it for all of 3 minutes, because again, why more? Oh, so sorry. Okay, the first thing that you need to know about the Articles of Confederation government is that it is Confederate in form. Okay, Confederate in form. Is our current government Confederate in form? No, it's federal, right? So a Confederate government suggests that the real power lies with the states and the people. Just think back to the Confederacy, as opposed to what we have now, where the federal government is supreme. There were a lot of things that the Articles of Confederation could not do that are going to lend itself to why they're eventually going to, go bye-bye. For example, they couldn't tax. That's a problem, right? It's how a government functions. Got to bring in revenue. They couldn't regulate trade. That's an issue because there were 13 different states and you kept having problems. And speaking to that, there was a singular branch. It was just the Articles of Confederation Congress, right? You guys, your hands are going to hurt so much by the time we're done with this. I'm sorry. And the Articles of Confederation Congress just had one person per state. So New Jersey is over there with, just like a few people. And then you've got Virginia that is crazy populated, and they're going to get mad about that. Also, so with it just being a singular branch, there is no national executive or judiciary to settle disputes. That's not good. And there's no real power to maintain an army or a navy, which that's not great if we're going to have an issue with other nations. And seeing as though we just got out of a war and we're trying to kind of run this new country, we're going to have issues with other nations. Remember, Spain tried to just take over the Mississippi River, and we were like, ah. And the British wouldn't leave. It's so awkward. We beat you. Just get it. No, they wouldn't. It's like that house guest that stays too long. You're just like, oh, leave. Please note that Shays' Rebellion took this down. Shays' Rebellion proved all of the issues with the Articles of Confederation when a rebellion of angry farmers with pitchforks over taxation policies in Massachusetts could not be quelled. It could not. There was no army ready to go. The Massachusetts militia included many of the farmers who were rebelling. So it was a real problem. And if you do bring up Shays' Rebellion in an FRQ for any reason, it wouldn't hurt to make the connection to the Whiskey Rebellion, because the Shays' Rebellion proved the articles were too weak, whereas the Whiskey Rebellion proved the Constitution was strong. So Shays showed that we've got significant issues, and the Whiskey Rebellion showed that our government's good to go. Look at this president. Look at, he's actually riding out on a horse and he's putting on his military uniform, even though it was really tight. Yeah. Okay. By the way, this is tea. I just feel like I need to make that clear. It looks like scotch in the window. It is not scotch. Okay. I think scotch is disgusting. And 2, that would be incredibly unprofessional. So it's tea. It's tea. Hey, Linz. Okay. So there you go. Not being able to regulate trade has really created this unstable economy. Not having the power to maintain an army and put down Shays' Rebellion is pointing out the weaknesses and maybe the problems that we have. And so that's why we have the Constitutional Convention. Okay. So why don't we just write down a couple of things about the Constitutional Convention? I don't think it would hurt. Okay. So you can't talk about the Constitutional Convention without talking about the Great Compromise, right? You've got to talk about it. I can't imagine there would be an AP exam where you do not have a question about the Great Compromise. So if you can just remember that it's the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan that they have to find a compromise between, the Virginia plan being the large state plan. And I don't think you need to know specifics about either of these, just that large states liked the Virginia plan because they had more representation. And the New Jersey plan being the small state plan. If you want to put in parentheses that they propose to just keep the existing Articles of Confederation Congress, that's not a bad idea. So the New Jersey plan just wanted to keep that one body assembly where all the states were represented equally. So we've got two different things here. We meet in the middle, and the Great Compromise produces our bicameral legislature. And I want you to use that language because then you get to the fact that it's two houses, right? Two chambers. And that the House of Representatives is based on population. And the Senate is based on equality. So the Virginia plan supporters are pleased with the House. And the New Jersey plan supporters are pleased with the Senate. I mean, really, it's a pretty impressive compromise, really, when you stop to think about it. I don't think they're going to ask you compromise on the executive, but if they do, you can just say that they compromise between having a popular vote and followed by an electoral vote. Okay. Because some founding fathers argued for a direct election of the president, but the others won out. And that's why the president is still, to this day, indirectly elected by the people. Right? So the popular vote does not elect the president. It's the electoral vote, which we've learned in our history 5 times when the winner of the popular vote has not gone on to win the electoral vote, most recently 2016. But the closest one was 2000. Remember Bush versus Gore? It all came down to Florida. You guys know how many votes it came down to in that one county? 537. Isn't that crazy? That's crazy. Like what? 537. They counted a bunch. Okay. They also compromised on slavery and trade, but I don't think you're going to be asked that. So this is going to be kind of funky. What I want to do now, let me go to the chat. I want you guys to kind of make that T-chart again, but with 3 columns. And we're going to compare participatory, pluralist, and elitist democracy. Okay. Can you guys see the chat? Okay. Thanks. I don't know. So let's compare participatory democracy, pluralism, and elitism, because the founding fathers have to really kind of try to figure out what they're going to do to ensure that all 3 of these ways of explaining how the government is going to work are clear in the Constitution. So it's not a one or the other. There's examples of each of these in the way our government works today. So let's talk first about participatory democracy. I just want you to know that it's characterized by a wide range of participation, okay? by a wide range of participation. And probably the best example is when people vote for representatives. Right? Because remember, guys, at the onset of our nation, it was the representatives that were the only office that were directly elected. That rings a bell, right? Write that out to the side, folks. The House of Representatives is the truest representation of American majoritarian democracy. Sorry, I'm working through like a splitting headache right now. I got the vaccine, the second one yesterday, and it rocked my world. So, okay. And really for participatory democracy, you could also just write that this is all the ways that we can participate politically. So really think about this, writing a letter to our representatives, protesting, signing a petition, reading the news about politics. This just shows that our democracy is going to be run with the widest range of participation possible from the people. I mean, we have a republic, guys. We have an indirect democracy. We have a representative democracy. Whatever one of those words you want to use or phrases, they're synonymous. They mean the same thing. It means that the people have power, but we elect those to speak on our behalf and to govern our nation, okay? Okay. The pluralist democracy, if I were you, I would know that this is all about no one group dominating. Do you guys remember the F word? Factions. Factions, yeah. So no one faction can dominate over the others. And a good example of this are the massive amount of interest groups that we have. And for my kiddos that I have currently, that's what we're learning about next week, okay? But just think the ARP, just think NRA, think all of them that are out there. And believe it or not, another example of how pluralist democracy is seen in the Constitution is through the concept of separation of powers. Really, because if one body is controlling one branch, if one party is controlling one branch or one people of a similar mindset, they still have to work with the other branches to get the job done, right? And of course, that should bring to your mind checks and balances. We'll get there in a minute. But yeah, they have specific things that they do, and we couldn't operate, our government couldn't function with just one of the branches. It couldn't function without one of the branches. So there you go. So that's how pluralism is evident in our democracy. And then finally, elitism. Even though elitism is the idea that power, like real power, true power, is in the hands of the wealthy and the educated, it's not true for everything, okay? Andrew Jackson was the people's president. The House of Representatives, they're younger, they represent districts. Plenty of times they're not super duper wealthy. We have had representatives without a high school diploma before, but we really don't have senators without that. You guys follow that? My dog's gonna be really loud because my husband just got home, just FYI. But a good example of elitism being evident in our democracy is the Electoral College, right? Yeah, I mean, we don't directly elect the president. There's a reason for that. Also, all of our Supreme Court justices graduated from super prestigious law schools, okay? Nobody went to the University of Alabama Law School. Hi, sweetie, I'm on a Zoom call, okay? I'm on a Zoom call, just FYI. Okay. Never know. Sean Nutter is always always keeps you guessing. Also, a ton of members of Congress have money well over $1 million, like well over. So that's an example of elitism being evident in our democracy. Do you want to say hi? My students. Well, now you have to, because if you don't, you're going to seem like a jerk.
Hi, students.
They're waving at you. Okay. I have to do this. We have an AP exam. Besides, they come first today. All right. So I would like to speak for just a minute, still sticking with participatory democracy, pluralism, and elitism by looking at two foundational documents, Brutus 1 and Federalist 10. Okay. So maybe underneath where you just wrote that, this would be a good place to write this information. Brutus 1 really advocated for participatory democracy, right? That's what he wanted. That's what he felt was best for the nation. He hated elitism. He recognized that it would happen. He feared that the power given to the central government under the Constitution threatened liberty. And don't you guys see how participatory democracy is a little bit more evident in the Articles of Confederation than the other two? Yeah, it just is, because the states and the people maintained the true power, right? Now, Federalist 10, on the other hand, Federalist 10 really kind of focused on how participatory democracy was still there in the Constitution, by allowing for a lot of choice for people to participate in all of these factions, right? James Madison does not speak to elitism in Federalist 10. All he does in Federalist 10, and you might want to write this phrase specifically, I'll write it in the chat, is that a large republic is the best defense against factions. That's what he said. A large republic is the best defense against factions. And really, if you think about it, factions can easily form in the Articles of Confederation because all the states are separate. And if a faction completely takes over the state, well, then you're just SOL. That's what's happening, right? But that won't happen here. Okay, are we okay with that? Great. You know what I want to do now? I want to talk about the Constitution. So here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to write Constitution real big. And then we're just going to kind of briefly define what's in each article. And I mean briefly. Hey, you remember that Constitution packet that took a lot of time that I had you do? That's helpful. You should use that. I promise I don't give you stuff just to give you stuff. It's good. And what we're getting ready to do is that first page. Okay. Honey, would you bring me my phone just so I can keep an eye on my time? Thank you. Well, I have it full screen, so I can't see. All righty. So Article 1 is the legislative branch. We already talked about the preamble. Thank you. Hang on, guys. I'm getting reminds from people. Yes, I'm recording it. Yes, I'm recording it. Okay. So it's all about the legislative branch, right? So again, you should reference the Great Compromise. and you should write down that it lists all the qualifications of the House and the Senate. I don't know if you guys are going to be asked these, but it's good to know that the qualifications for the House are less stringent than they are for the Senate because there's more of them. They don't have as much power and prestige. So as long as you understand that there's more in the House, their terms are only 2 years, and they're more likely to be delegates than trustees like the Senate, you should be fine. But I'll go more into that on another Zoom session. All righty. I want us to know 2 clauses from Article 1. Okay. They are the necessary and proper clause and the commerce clause. Okay. Necessary and proper and commerce. Got to know these 2. So the necessary and proper clause, that's what gives Congress their implied powers, right? There are things that are not stated expressly, but they are implied. So I would know that if I were you. And I would also know that this clause was legitimized by the Supreme Court through the Supreme Court case of McCulloch versus Maryland. And I know there's a couple of people on this call who had that assigned SCOTUS case. McCulloch versus Maryland, all right? Remember the National Bank case? Maryland tried to tax the National Bank and said that the National Bank wasn't even constitutional because the Constitution didn't say that Congress could do it. And the Supreme Court says, it says it right here that Congress can do whatever is necessary and proper for carrying into execution their foregoing express powers. And this helps them borrow, tax, spend, and circulate money. So yeah, they can do it. And then the Commerce Clause involved the case US v. Lopez. That high school senior that brought a gun to school. Remember him? Alfonso Lopez. Not a good idea, Alfonso, especially when the Gun-Free School Zones Act is passed. And what was so interesting about US versus Lopez is it actually limited Congress's power under the Commerce Clause. I'm telling you guys, people mess that up in that case all the time. I can imagine the AP exam asking about that, like trying to, like dig in and make sure you are understanding that this was an example of Congress's power being limited. It was expanded through McCulloch. It was limited through US versus Lopez. Okay. But by the way, both of those cases are examples of my favorite F word, not factions, not Friday, not fudge, but federalism. Federalism. Because Maryland tried to challenge a federal law and the government said no, right? States have the power to tax just like the federal government has the power to tax. It's called a concurrent power, but the states cannot tax an entity of the federal government. No. And US versus Lopez, Congress tried to say you can't bring a gun on campus and tried to pass a law saying that if there are rules against bringing a gun on campus, it's going to help with that area's economy. And it's going to make businesses more likely to move there and economics and trade will be freer. And the Supreme Court said, no, first off, education, that's a state thing. Federalism, right? Hey, here's a concept I want to make sure you know. Separation of powers versus division of powers. Ready? Separation of powers versus division of powers. Separation of powers is that horizontal taking of the government power and splitting it up. Let's just go with an S for separation, splitting it up among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Okay. So it's splitting up the federal government power. That's separation of power. Division of power, that's federalism, right? And it's more of a vertical divide. The federal government has some stuff that it does, but state governments have some stuff that they do. Okay. They might ask you that. And if they do, good for them, because it's a good thing to get you thinking. Hey, and by the way, with separation of powers comes checks and balances, right? I guarantee you'll be asked to provide some examples of those, or to identify which examples are accurate if you're given a choice. And by the way, since we're here, that's what James Madison talked about in Federalist 51, right? Checks and balances. In Federalist 51, Madison spoke of how the Constitution protects liberty through checks and balances. Remember that quote, if all men were angels, no government would be necessary. And ambition must be made to counteract ambition. So good. I just can't write like that. But that's okay. I have the Federalist papers if I ever need to see that. Okay. How are you there? Okay, great. So that was Article 1, but Article 2 and 3 really fit well with this idea of checks and balances and separation of powers, because Article 2 is the executive branch, correct? And it involves a lot of things, specifically qualifications, the Electoral College, and the Vice President. So qualifications, the Electoral College, and the Vice President. And the President is the only office with the qualification that you've got to be a natural born citizen. All right. It's the only one. You don't have to be a natural born citizen to be in the House or the Senate. And there's no qualifications to be on the Supreme Court, although we all know the informal qualifications, right? Okay. You go with 2. Article 2 has the executive power clause. The executive power clause, which gives the president his or her one day implied powers. Okay. And do you know what I mean by implied powers? I'm talking about those unilateral presidential actions, like executive orders, which have the force of law but don't go through Congress, executive agreements, which have the force of law but don't go through Congress, signing statements, and executive privilege. I know I spelled privilege wrong, sorry. It'll be okay. And we can talk about that more with our next Zoom, because next Zoom will be on Unit 2, faux show. Okay. Article 3 is the judicial branch. And it really just talks about SCOTUS, okay? Just talks about SCOTUS. And it says any other courts, Congress can make them. So that's good to know. It really just talks about SCOTUS and any other courts Congress can make. Article 4 deals with relationships among the states. I really can't imagine you're going to see a question on Article 4, but if you do, there's the full faith and credit clause, as well as the privileges and immunities clause. Full faith and credit clause means that states have to respect each other's laws and decisions. And privileges and immunities, if I'm not from Florida and I'm in Florida and I participate in a protest, I still have free speech. And they can't get me in trouble. They can't say, all right, all the Florida people, you can do this. Anybody who's out of state, get out of here. No, that doesn't work that way. Okay. Okay. Article 5 is the amendment process. This is important. Okay. The amendment process. And guys, you're doing great. We've only got 17 more minutes. Okay. You need to know that this is another phenomenal example of federalism, right? Because both the federal government and the state governments are involved in this process. And really, it's the states that have the last say. It really is. So you're not going to need to know too many like fractions or votes or supermajorities, but this is one of them. So it takes 2/3 to propose an amendment in Congress. So both of them have to agree to that, right? Yeah. And then it takes 3/4 of the state legislators to ratify. And notice that word that I'm using, ratify, that's the word you should use, ratify. And there's other methods, but of the 27 amendments, 26 have been done this way. So this is the one you can talk about, okay? If you want to give a good example of how this works or doesn't work, you can always talk about the Equal Rights Amendment. How it failed to ratify in the states. And it was proposed in 1972, but I don't think they're going to ask that. We good with amendments? Yeah. No, there's 27 of them. I know. You don't have to know all 27. You don't. Just know there's 27. And you should know that the first 10 are the Bill of Rights. Okay. Because if you're asked to talk about the Constitution, you can pull in the Bill of Rights. You can pull in other amendments. You can pull in all sorts of things. It's a big document. Okay, Article 6 is national supremacy. And if I were you, I would know about the supremacy clause, right? And it was also upheld in McCulloch versus Maryland. So it says the federal government is supreme over state governments. If there is going to be like a head-to-head issue, the federal government's going to come out on top. It's just how it works. Okay. And then the 7th Amendment, all you need to know is or the 7th article, excuse me. All you need to know is about it's about ratification, and that 9 out of the 13 states were needed to ratify the Constitution. And that's a departure from the Articles of Confederation. 9 out of 13. Woo! And that's the 7 articles in a nutshell. How do you feel about those? Yeah, good. Okay. Let's just talk about a few amendments. Not all of them, just a few, and then we'll be done. Okay, my loves? Okay. let's talk about the Bill of Rights. This was something that was added to the Constitution following its ratification as a promise to the anti-federalists, okay? The anti-federalists said, if you add this, we'll sign it. And James Madison said, okay. Okay. So 1 through 10 came in a package deal, all right? It was actually 1 through 12, but they only ratified 10 of them. I don't think you'll have to know the other two. I'm positive you won't have to know the other two. One of them is the 27th Amendment, but it's no big deal. All right, First Amendment, it's a biggie. It's a biggie. So it's speech, press, religion, assembly, and petition. Biggie. Probably the biggest two for our purposes are speech and religion. Yeah, speech and religion for sure. When you're thinking of religion, I want you to know the two clauses, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. Wish I could type. Usually can. It'll be okay. So the Establishment and the Free Exercise Clause, those are the ones you should know. And since we're here for the Establishment Clause, if I were you, I would know the Engel versus Vitale case, right? Prayer in school, no. Because that was the state of New York trying to create a law regarding an establishment of religion, and that's not okay. You can't do that. The Free Exercise Clause, that is the Wisconsin versus Yoder case. That was those Amish kids going to school, didn't want to go past the 8th grade. And Wisconsin said, you need to go past the 8th grade. They said, but freedom of religion. And the Supreme Court said, you're right. Freedom of religion. Okay. How about speech? A lot of Supreme Court cases, right? You got Tinker. Remember that? The black armbands that the brother and sister wore to protest the Vietnam War. And the school got them in trouble because they were causing a disturbance, or so they said. This doesn't really disturb anybody, I'm gonna be honest with you. And so that was upholding student speech. I forget which justice it was. Maybe Potter Stewart said that when we walk into school, we don't shed our constitutional liberties at the door. There's Schenck versus US. And remember, he spoke out against the draft during World War I. And was thrown in jail for it because what he did created a clear and present danger to the war effort. And that established that clear and present danger test. So not always is speech going to be an absolute right. If you say gun in school or fire in a crowded building and you cause a disturbance, that's not free speech. You can't say bomb on an airplane. I mean, you can, but you're going to be let off that airplane in handcuffs and you're a dum-dum, right? Also, for press, it's the Pentagon Papers case with New York Times v. Sullivan. Nope. New York Times versus US. I'm so sorry. Versus Sullivan is something else. The New York Times versus the US, this was the Pentagon Papers. Not only did this say that the government could not censor newspapers, and it basically strengthened the concept of prior restraint, that you cannot hold someone back prior to them publishing something. The government tried to say it was a, what's it called? It was a,
Why can't I think?
It interfered with national security. And the Supreme Court said, no, it didn't. You did something you weren't supposed to do. And they caught you. So there you go. All right. So that's kind of the First Amendment in a nutshell. Is that okay? Yeah. For the Second Amendment, if I were you, I would know the Supreme Court case, McDonald versus US. Remember Otis McDonald wanted to have a handgun to defend himself in, scary Chicago. And there was a law saying that he couldn't. Well, luckily for Mr. McDonald, 2 years prior, in 2008, the Supreme Court had finally found that the Second Amendment allows an individual the right to bear arms, that it was an individual right, not just a collective right. Really, isn't that nuts? The Supreme Court didn't make that decision until 2008. And so McDonald used that case, DC versus Heller, as precedent to make it apply to all of the states. Do you guys recall what that process is, where we make the Bill of Rights also extend to the states? It's selective incorporation, right? So maybe if you want to write that in parentheses next to McDonald versus US, that it's an incorporation case. Not a bad idea. And don't forget that this all comes from the 14th Amendment's due process clause. That's how selective incorporation gradually makes protections against the federal government provided for in the Bill of Rights also pertain to states. Selective incorporation. Need to know it, need to know it, need to know it. Say it one more time. Why not? Need to know it. It is a crucial.com concept. Okay, crucial.com. A lot of people always think about the 14th Amendment and they think about the Equal Protection Clause. The Equal Protection Clause is great. It's great, but it has to do with discrimination. This has to do with making the Bill of Rights one at a time apply to the states as well. Okay. I don't think you'll be asked about Amendment 3. Amendment 4, search and seizure. Maybe they'll ask you about the exclusionary rule. 5, it also includes due process. I don't think so, but 6, they could ask you about Gideon versus Wainwright. And this involves the rights of the accused, specifically having the right to counsel. And this is also an incorporation case. So Florida was trying to say Mr. Gideon did not have the right to an attorney because he did not commit a capital offense. And that's what the 6th Amendment says. And they said that's only if the federal government is charging you. Well, he took his case to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court agreed. You still need an attorney. And if you can't afford one, the state will provide one to you. Because if you can't afford one, you're not going to get a fair shake. You're like, not at all. Okay. Gideon had an 8th grade education. Even if you go to law school for 1 year, you're still going to struggle. Okay. I don't think they're going to ask you about the 7th Amendment. Maybe you'll talk about the 8th Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment. I doubt it, but I do think you should know the 10th Amendment because it's reserved powers for the states. This is what made all those Article of Confederation fans, all those anti-federalists, very happy. This and the 9th Amendment, because the 9th Amendment is unenumerated rights for people. Like the Constitution doesn't say anything about driving. You can drive. You can drive, but the state can regulate driving. The Constitution doesn't mention anything about tobacco use. You can use tobacco, but the states can make laws about that use and sale and age of tobacco. Until the federal government passes a law about it and makes it 21. So there you go. which made states really mad. I feel like that's good for today. What do you guys think? Yeah. So I'm going to make a note that we did not get past the 10th Amendment, because I'm going to want to make sure that later on we do talk a wee bit more about the 14th Amendment and then some other amendments that have to do with suffrage. But really, I think you guys did well. So listen, that thing that I put in the chat earlier, I wonder, yeah, I just put it in there again. That's your review sheet. It's my suggested pacing. It has a link to this fabulous book that I think you would find really helpful, like really helpful. And it tells you when I'm going to be doing these Zooms and things in the future. Not to mention all these helpful links with graphic organizers and such. Okay. Hey, I really appreciate you guys taking the time to come today. I know you didn't have to, but I think you're going to be glad you did. And I certainly am glad to see you. You brought a ray of sunshine to my otherwise cloudy, vaccinated symptom day. So thanks for being your wonderful selves, and I'll see you later, maybe next Friday. Okay, bye. Bye, darlings. So good to see you. Hey, Sarah.
Hi, I just had a question.
Yeah.
So I bought the Barron's AP review book.
Okay.
Would that one be good, or should I get that other book instead?